Good afternoon. I'm Jay Traynor, Chief Operating Officer at the National Archives, and I would like to welcome you to this exciting joint panel presentation featuring staff from the National Archives, Arlington National Cemetery, and the National Museum of the American Indian. They'll be covering the implications of the 1919 Citizenship Act for Indigenous military service in World War I, the American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, and Zitkala-Sa, also known as Gertrude Simmons Bonin. The National Archives is proud to preserve the records of a wide range of voices, including Zkalasha and others who wrote to the government demanding change. The documentary history we preserve and make accessible shows how the United States government and its relationship to American Indian nations has evolved over time, from early treaties to the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 to the present day. It is always gratifying to see how these records can be used by historians and others to tell the story of our nation. This event, sponsored jointly by our three agencies, represents one of the many ways that we all preserve and make accessible the documentary history of our nation. I hope you enjoy the presentations by these expert speakers. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rose Buchanan, and I am an archivist and subject matter expert for Native American-related records at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. On June 2, 1924, Congress enacted the Indian Citizenship Act. The act consists of a single sentence, that all non-citizen Indians born within the territorial limits of the United States be, and they are hereby declared to be, citizens of the United States, provided that the granting of such citizenship shall not in any manner impair or otherwise affect the right of any Indian in tribal or other property. Today, 100 years later, we recognize this act as granting U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. But the history of the act and of Native American citizenship is more complex than the text would suggest. Native people, of course, were here long before the United States existed. But when the country was established, Native people did not automatically become U.S. citizens. In fact, the federal government initially considered Native people to be citizens of separate nations. The government actually used to issue passports for Americans traveling through Native lands, just like the government issues passports for U.S. citizens traveling abroad today. But the federal government shifted its policies in the early 19th century as it sought to expand the country's western borders and open up more land for white settlers. Officials increasingly began to use U.S. citizenship as a negotiating tool and incentive to entice Native people to give up their homelands. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the president to negotiate with tribes for their lands within existing state borders in exchange for the tribes moving to reservations west of the Mississippi River. Some of the resulting treaties, like the Choctaw Treaty of 1830, included provisions by which tribal members could avoid removal if they accepted a small plot of land and became U.S. citizens. But individuals typically had to break ties with their tribe, demonstrate to government officials' satisfaction that they had successfully assimilated into European American society, and face other hardships to become U.S. citizens in this way. As a result, relatively few people chose to do this. The General Allotment Act of 1887, also known as the Dawes Act, sought to open up even more land for settlers. The act authorized the federal government to break up Native American reservations set aside under previous treaties, assign land parcels to tribal members, and sell remaining lands. Under this act and additional acts that followed, Native Americans who agreed to the government's demands and accepted an allotment were granted U.S. citizenship. But land ownership and citizenship were still conditional. Native allottees did not receive patents for their land or citizenship until after a government-designated trust period, usually 25 years, had expired. An allotment as a whole was devastating for tribal communities. It undermined Native sovereignty and led to millions of acres of tribal lands being sold to non-Natives. In response to the devastation of the allotment era, organizations like the Society of American Indians and activists like Zitkala-Sa, a Yankton Dakota woman who co-founded the National Council of American Indians, lobbied for U.S. citizenship to be extended to all Native people. These activists believed that being a U.S. citizen would open up additional legal avenues that they could use to fight for their land, their cultural practices, and their other rights. And in 1919, Congress offered a pathway to citizenship for Native Americans who had served honorably during World War I. So, by 1924, an estimated 2/3 of Native Americans were technically already U.S. citizens, whether because of allotment, military service, or another provision under the law. The Indian Citizenship Act extended U.S. citizenship to the remaining 1/3 of Native people and to future generations born in the United States. However, almost immediately after the act was passed, there was widespread confusion about the law's implications, especially when it came to something we now see as a fundamental right of citizenship, the right to vote. 1924 was a presidential election year, and after the Citizenship Act was passed, many Native people understandably turned up at the polls, expecting to be able to vote as U.S. citizens. But voting eligibility at the time wasn't just a matter of reaching a certain age and filling out a voter registration form. This was the height of the Jim Crow era, and of English literacy tests and poll taxes and other discriminatory practices that specifically tried to deter people of color from voting. And Native people, like African Americans and others, were adversely affected by these practices, something that the 1924 citizenship law didn't address at all. Here at the National Archives in DC, we have a correspondence file in our Bureau of Indian Affairs records that documents what happened in some of these cases. This letter from the Bureau's Santa Fe field office talks about how 46 Navajos registered to vote and actually cast their ballots in the 1924 election, but the county refused to count them. A member of the Navajo Tribal Council was actually turned away at the polls. The letter writer explains that the county elections and the election for state governor were so close that the Navajos' votes could have made a difference in swinging in those elections, so this was consequential. So the Bureau's response in this case and similar ones was essentially, sorry, the new citizenship law says nothing about voting. States handle voting. That's not the Bureau's legal jurisdiction. Before the next presidential election in 1928, the Bureau tried to get ahead of questions about voting by releasing a special circular directing field officials to advise Native people about their voting eligibility under state law. But here we actually see a letter from 1931 where a state elections official asked whether Native people were citizens and were eligible to vote. This from a state elections official whom you would think would know the laws. So there was still confusion about Native people's status under the 1924 Citizenship Act. We also continued to see frustration on the part of Native people who tried to vote. For example, here's a letter from Fred Bean in 1932. Mr. Bean explains that he and his wife, who were members of the Minnesota Chippewa, were turned away at the voting booth and were told that they had to be examined by a federal judge before they could vote to see if they were, quote, living like white people. Mr. Bean was upset because, as he explained, he and his wife were educated and were completely self-sufficient, so why did they have to prove this to anyone? Even into 1941, during World War II, we see a letter from Seneca author and veteran Jesse Cornplanter asking what his rights were under the 1924 Act and how come his community wasn't told about the act at the time. So, in many states, notably those with large Native American populations, it took decades after the original 1924 Citizenship Act for many Native people to be able to vote unchallenged and to exercise what we see as a fundamental right of citizenship. In Arizona and New Mexico, for example, courts struck down laws and provisions in the state constitutions that prevented Natives from voting after Native people sued to challenge them. Miguel Trujillo, a member of the Isleta Pueblo, brought the successful case in New Mexico, and because it was heard in a federal court, the National Archives has records of the case at our Denver facility. In other states, state legislatures eventually overturned discriminatory laws, either in response to Native activism or because of changes in federal laws, or both. So the story of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 doesn't begin in 1924 or end in 1924. It's part of this much broader history of Native activism and resilience in response to shifting federal government policies. And it's a story we're fortunate to be able to preserve and share through our records here at the National Archives.
Good afternoon. I am Rachelle Pablo of the Red Running Into the Water Clan, Born for the Water Comes Together clan of the Dene or Navajo Nation. I'm the Museum Specialist of the National Native American Veterans Memorial here at Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. I'd like to share how NMAI contributes to the memory and honoring of Zitkala-Sa, which translates to Redbird and is also known as Gertrude Simmons Bonin. Zkalasha was born on the Yankton Sioux Reservation in 1876, which was the United States centennial and the same year of the Battle of Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand. She attended a Quaker boarding school at White's Manual Labor Institute and a liberal arts college, Earlham College, both in Indiana. As Gertrude Simmons, she taught music for a brief period at Carlisle Indian Boarding School during the infamous Richard Pratt years. After Carlisle, she departed to attend the respected New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, Massachusetts. While living in Utah with her husband Raymond Bonin on the Uinta Reservation, she composed a Sundance opera with William F. Hanson, who taught music at Brigham Young University. She was an effective writer and had a profound impact on Native American rights. She was a member of the Society of American Indian and had a falling out, but quickly co-founded the National Council of the American Indian with her husband and had much influence in many arenas and greatly contributed to the passing of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. This is a photo of William Hanson and Zitkala-Sa. There were several performances of the Sundance Opera in Utah, which began in 1913. Many of the performers were a mix of Native American and non-Native American participants. In March of 1938, the Sundance Opera at New York City's The Broadway Theater displayed their marquee, only acknowledging William Hanson as the sole composer. This event occurred 3 months after the passing of Zitkala-Sa. What is the National Museum of the American Indians' connection to Zitkala-Sa? From 2014 to 2015, the exhibition Indelible, the platinum photography of Larry McNeil and Will Wilson were on display. A Joseph Kiley photograph of a 22-year-old Zitkala-Sa was part of the exhibition. In 2022, a View into Two Worlds article in American Indian magazine was written by Dr. Michelle Delaney. Also in 2022, a letter of support for the American Women Quarter Series was submitted by NMAI staff member Dr. Michelle Delaney for the U.S. Mint's American Women Quarters program. In 2023, artist Raven Chacon, in concert and conversation with Joy Harjo, Candace Hopkins, Ange Loft, Laura Ortman, and Olivia Short. This Friday on November 29th at NMAI is Native American Heritage Day, honoring Zitkala-Sa with hoop dancer, star chief of the Shikanju Lakota Sioux tribe. NMAI will partner with Smithsonian American Women's History Museum and the United States Mint, recognizing Zitkala-Sa, who will be the 15th woman honored as part of the U.S. Mint's American Women Quarters program. Here is the Joseph Kiley photograph displayed in the exhibition of a 22-year-old Zitkala-Sa. During this period, she was working at the Carlisle Indian Boarding School, preparing to enter the New England Conservatory of Music at Boston, Massachusetts. A View into Two Worlds by Michelle Delaney can be found in the spring 2022 issue at the AmericanIndianMagazine.org website. On November 4, 2023, the Pulitzer Prize winner Raven Chacon moderated 5 participants of his work for Zitkala-Sa. They were U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo, Candace Hopkins, Ange Loft, Laura Ortman, and Olivia Short. This is a sketch or depiction of one of 6 scores. NMAI photographer Catherine Fogden describes this as, quote, Chacon dedicated this portfolio of scores to contemporary Native American and First Nations women to celebrate their contributions to music, end quote. Each of the scores were paired with instructions. The line of women composers are Autumn Chacon, Ange Loft, Olivia Short, Joy Harjo, Laura Ortman, and Candace Hopkins. These acts of honoring, I believe, are an acknowledgement of Indigenous women's role in music. Several lithographs are at the collections of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. The journey began in February 2022 when NMAI's Assistant Director of History and Culture, Dr. Michelle Delaney, submitted a letter of support for Zitkala-Sa for the 2024 American Women Quarter Series. Ending the connections between Zitkala-Sa and NMAI will be on Native American Heritage Day. This celebration is a collaboration amongst the United States Mint, the National Museum of the American Indian, and the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. In closing, from Dr. Delaney's 2022 letter of support for Zitkala-Sa, she writes, Zitkala-Sa worked throughout her lifetime to give voice and rights to Native Americans, Indigenous citizenship, and women's suffrage. It is appropriate in 2024 to focus on giving her a rightful place in American women's history and the creative arts and consider the connections that fostered her success.
As we've heard in our earlier presentations, the path to citizenship was a long and diverse one for many Native Americans. Today, here at Arlington National Cemetery, we're going to look at one specific piece of this role of citizenship in the lives of Native Americans, specifically their military service. Native Americans have a long tradition of service in the United States military, really going back to the foundations of this nation. Native Americans have served in every one of America's major conflicts from the American Revolution through today. In fact, currently, more Native Americans serve as a percentage of their ethnic population than any other group. That rate of service for Native Americans is upwards of 19%, whereas for most other ethnic groups, the percentage is more in the 14% range. While there have been many reasons that Native Americans have chosen to serve in the U.S. military, some themes do become common. In the 18th and 19th centuries, for example, many were likely motivated by the desire to secure better treaty terms with the United States government and also to protect their ancestral homelands from encroachment of white settlers. This continued through the end of the 19th century. By the Spanish-American War, not only did Native American males serve, but also females as well. In fact, there were 4 nuns who served as nurses in Cuba supporting the U.S. military. Another role for Native Americans in the U.S. military in the latter half of the 19th century was service as Indian Scouts. Congress had authorized 1,000 indigenous peoples to serve as scouts for the U.S. Army as it was campaigning through the Great Plains and into the western United States. One such renowned scout was Chief Plentycoo. Chief Plentycoo of the Crow Nation was one of General George Crook's senior scouts during the Battle of Rosebud in Montana in 1876. In honor of his long and distinguished service, the Army presented him with a special flag. At the interment of the unknown soldier from the First World War on November 11, 1921, Chief Plenikout himself was a distinguished attendee. At the end of that ceremony, Plenikout honored the American unknown by presenting his war bonnet as well as his riding staff and lance as a gift from one warrior to another. It also underscores the point that the American unknown very well may have been a Native American service member who died in Europe. The tradition of military service continued into the 20th century. By World War I, however, the motivations for many indigenous people had changed. No longer was there a possibility of securing better treaty terms or regaining lost homelands, because the reservation system had largely made that impossible. Instead, many Native Americans hoped to achieve citizenship rights through their military service. The question of citizenship rights is a complicated one and varied tribe to tribe because of the Dawes Act of 1876. However, over 6,000 additional American Indians volunteered to fight in the U.S. military during that conflict. One example is Private Golden Oxendine from Robertson, North Carolina. He died in France in 1918 from the Spanish influenza. Unlike African Americans who served in segregated units, the federal government considered indigenous people as white for military service. Therefore, most Native Americans were integrated into white combat units. As a result, they tended to die at higher rates. It's for this reason that the American unknown entombed at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier easily could have been a Native American service member. In addition to their roles in combat, some 10,000 other American Indians served as nurses or in the American Red Cross during the war. In 1919, Congress authorized any Native American service member who was honorably discharged from World War I to apply for citizenship, regardless of their tribal affiliation. Many had hoped that this would hasten the path to citizenship for all American Indians. However, that hope would not be fulfilled until 1924. So as we've seen throughout this webinar, this is the reason why Zkalasha's role as an activist and her push for the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 was so critical. It would once and for all settle these long-standing questions of citizenship rights for Native Americans, whether or not they had served in the military. So why is Zkalasha buried here in Section 2 at Arlington National Cemetery? Her husband, Raymond Bonnin, who Zkalasha met at the Standing Rock Reservation when she was working there in 1901 or 1902, was part Yankton Sioux, just like his wife. During World War I, Raymond Bonnin volunteered and fought in France during the First World War. As a result, he earned their eligibility to be buried here at Arlington. Today, the Bonnins rest here with Native Americans who have served and sacrificed throughout the history of our country. These include as diverse individuals as Ira Hayes, one of the famed Marine flag raisers from the Battle of Iwo Jima during World War II, up to Special Operations Master Sergeant Joshua Wheeler, who made the ultimate sacrifice in 2015 in Iraq while rescuing 70 prisoners from an ISIS-held camp. The history of our nation is truly told here at Arlington National Cemetery through the lives of the many veterans and their eligible dependents who are interred here. You can learn more about their stories and their contributions to the fabric of our nation through our education program, which is available at education.arlingtoncemetery.mil.
Thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you for joining us for today's Native American Heritage Month program, featuring staff from the National Archives, Arlington National Cemetery, and the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. We will now move on to the question and answer portion of today's event. I'm Amber Forrester, and I will serve as your moderator today. If you have any questions for our speakers, please add them to the chat box. We'll start with a question for Rose. I noticed that the title of the Indian Citizenship Act mentions certificates of citizenship. Did Native Americans receive certificates of citizenship because of the act?
So that's a great question. The reference to certificates of citizenship is actually a holdover from an earlier draft of the act. The original congressional bill proposed that Native Americans apply to the Secretary of the Interior for a certificate of citizenship, very similar to the general naturalization process where people who immigrated to the United States and wanted to become citizens would apply in court for citizenship. But some outside groups like the Indian Rights Association actually lobbied against requiring Native people to apply for citizenship. They thought that that would be like a barrier for people, an added barrier for people to pursue citizenship. And in the Bureau of Indian Affairs correspondence file that I mentioned in the video, we actually have a letter from the Indian Rights Association talking about that issue and why it would be a challenge for people if they had to apply. And I'm sure if you dug into congressional records about the act, you might be able to find other reasons or discussions about that change. But regardless, it seems that Congress just either forgot to update the title of the act after they removed that provision or otherwise didn't change it because it's still there.
Thank you, Rose. We have one more question for you at this time. The act mentions Native Americans' rights to property. What did that have to do with citizenship?
Right. So the act has a sort of provision at the end that says that getting the U.S. citizenship through the act wouldn't impair or otherwise affect Native Americans' property rights. And that was actually to address concerns that Congress had heard repeatedly over the years from Native people themselves, many of whom were worried that becoming U.S. citizens would mean that they'd lose their land. And this was a valid concern, right? We saw in the video that when the US government offered citizenship as an incentive for Native people to give up their land um, throughout the decades prior to the Citizenship Act. So when this blanket citizenship bill that would give every Native person born in the US US citizenship, when that was proposed, Congress wanted to make it very clear that they didn't mean citizenship to impact a Native person's rights to their allotment or tribal lands or whatever other property they had a right to.
Thanks, Rose. Steve, we have a couple questions for you now. Did World War I and service in that conflict have any impact on other groups aside from American Indians?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So I would say that with the Citizenship Act coming so soon after World War One, really within like 6 years or less from the ending of World War One, it's maybe a little bit easier to draw, point A to point B and say, well, World War One really certainly served as a catalyst, to push that question of Native American citizenship for all. But I do think you could basically, do this same kind of webinar with many other groups of individuals. So, For example, the one that comes to mind immediately are African Americans, right? So the Great Migration from the South to the North among African Americans had certainly began much earlier in the 19th century, like let's say after the Civil War. But if you look at African American service in World War One, and one of the a great book that's come out recently is called "The Torchbearers of Democracy" by Chad L. Williams, and um, in that book, I think that the author does a absolutely incredible job of at least kind of painting that line of like the long civil rights movement, if not before World War One, certainly as a result of World War One. Again, it really served as an accelerant to Native American, or I'm sorry, to African Americans, saying, again, we served honorably in World War One. We served honorably in combat units and other units as well. So where is citizenship? And as Rose did such a fantastic job pointing out, there were still those unanswered questions about, well, citizenship, okay, but what about voting rights and those sorts of things. So yeah, I would say that we see this impact across many different groups, and it really does, I think, serve to underpin just how important World War One was to the develop of the United States, throughout the 20th century.
Thanks, Steve. I have another question for you.
Sure.
Can you tell us more about Master Sergeant Wheeler's Native background?
Yes. So he is part Cherokee. So he was Cherokee Nation. Um, I don't know much more than that about his background, aside from, of course, it was a large, service that we had in 2015 for him at the cemetery, and um, yeah, that was one of the key points in his obituaries and for a lot of the family there, with his background.
All right, I'm going to have one more question for you, Steve, before we give you a break.
Okay.
How did the government decide where service members who died in World War One were buried?
Oh, that's interesting question. So, um, after or during the war, many hundreds or really thousands of temporary cemeteries were established across Europe, across France, generally in areas of relatively close proximity to the major battlefields and campaigns. The idea was that we needed a effective way to bury, unfortunately, mass numbers of casualties just because of the nature of the fighting in World War One. But the idea was always that those temporary cemeteries after the war was over would be consolidated to a much fewer number of cemeteries. After the war ended, the United States government gave families the opportunity to make a determination if they would like their loved ones brought home for reburial, repatriation at the government's expense in the United States, or if they wanted their loved one to remain buried in what would become a permanent American run national cemetery in Europe. So, roughly about 30% of family members did request that their loved ones be returned home for burial in the United States. And that could be either at a local cemetery or at a national cemetery. So, several thousand service members killed in France ultimately were repatriated to sections 18 and 19 of Arlington for reburial in the 1920, 1921, probably into 1922. Those that remained in Europe are buried in one of the permanent American cemeteries there. Those cemeteries are now run by the American Battle Monuments Commission, ABMC. So these again are government furnished markers. They are on, in United States administered cemeteries. overseas, right? So there are a large number of World War I service members buried at those ABMC sites, as well as those repatriated to the United States.
Thank you, Steve. Rachelle, we have a question for you. Are there online records at Carlisle and at Brigham Young regarding citizenship documenting Zkalasha's life as an activist?
I'm sorry. I'm off mute now. In regards specifically with the Indian Citizenship Act, I don't think I'm aware of that. A lot of the documents that I did find were about her teaching music and her activities with the students, or when she would leave in regards to leaving for training in Boston and then returning. However, that may be there. I'm not sure. Rose, would you be able to, are you aware of any of that? I did not find any when I did go in my research.
Yeah, in terms of records, like you said, specifically documenting her activism around the Citizenship Act, nothing comes to mind offhand. And we do have in that Bureau of Indian Affairs correspondence file that I highlighted, or one of our Bureau of Indian Affairs correspondence files. We have some letters that she sent right before the act, and if I recall the date correctly, about just how Native people could organize and make sure they were if they were going to organize for like lobbying purposes. So those records can be found in our holdings here at the National Archives. If she wrote to Congress or petitioned to Congress, I could see that being in some congressional records that are preserved, again, here at the National Archives, but I don't know of an online source immediately.
And I think we need to consider the timeline as well, because that was 1924. And when she was at Carlisle, that was at 1898 to early 1900s.
Thank you both. Rose, we have a couple more questions for you. What were all the ways that Native Americans could become U.S. citizens before the Indian Citizenship Act?
Ooh, I don't know if I know all the ways offhand that they could become citizens, but in the Bureau of Indian Affairs bulletin about Native citizenship that I mentioned in the video, they for one, they say this would be too much to try to list all of the different congressional acts affecting citizenship for different tribes. As I think Steve did a good job highlighting in his video, it was the circumstances were different depending on which tribal nation we're talking about. But in general, the Bureau did highlight some of the major ways that Native Americans could become citizens before the act. And those included, like we mentioned, treaty provisions. Like we saw that in the 1830 treaty with the Choctaw, through allotments like under the Dawes Act and by obtaining a patent for allotted land. There was another provision under the Dawes Act that talked about Native Americans becoming citizens if they lived apart from their tribe and adopted, quote unquote, the habits of civilized life, usually meaning if they assimilated into the predominantly white society. But we kind of saw the limitations of that in Mr. Bean's letter, where he was, concerned about citizenship and the right to vote, and that was called into question unless he could prove that he was living like a white person, so-called. There was birthright citizenship. If a person's parents were Native Americans who had already become U.S. citizens, either through allotment or another provision, if those parents had a child, then that child would also be a U.S. citizen. Of course, as Steve talked about, there was you become a citizen through honorable service in World War I. For Native women between 1888 and 1922, if they married a U.S. citizen man, then they also became a U.S. citizen. That was similar to how it worked for other married women at the time. Their citizenship followed their husbands. I mentioned 1922 because that's when Congress passed an act that kind of started the process of uncoupling
a woman's citizenship from her kind of marriage status. And then there were a plethora of special acts of Congress pertaining to specific tribes and citizenship. One that the Bureau of Indian Affairs highlights in their citizenship bulletin was a 1921 act that extended citizenship to all members of the Osage. So it depends, it varies what year and what tribe we're considering, but there are multiple different ways over the years.
Thank you. And then this is a little bit of a follow-up to that. Could Native Americans who became U.S. citizens before the Indian Citizenship Act vote?
Technically, they could vote if they otherwise met the voting requirements of their particular state or jurisdiction, just like it was after the Indian Citizenship Act was passed. But meeting those requirements wasn't always a given. For example, just going with the Native women example, if a Native woman married a U.S. citizen man after 1888, they would become a U.S. citizen through their marriage, but they would not have been able to vote in all states or jurisdictions until the 19th Amendment guaranteed women's right to vote in 1919. Even then, I imagine there are probably other requirements that Native citizen women would have had to meet to be able to vote at that time. There was actually a U.S. Supreme Court case in the 1880s, Elk v. Wilkins, that dealt with aspects of this issue. John Elk, who was Winnebago, was born on a reservation, but later lived separately from his tribe in Omaha, Nebraska. And when he tried to register to vote in 1880, the elections official refused to register him. So Mr. Elk sued under the 14th Amendment, which had extended citizenship to anyone born or naturalized in the U.S. He said, I was born in the U.S. and I live separately from my tribe, so I'm a citizen, should not be able to vote. And that was kind of what the federal government, the policy they've been communicating to Native people, right, over the years, saying that, if you separate from your tribe, if you live among the predominantly white society, you could become a citizen. But the Supreme Court ultimately ruled against Mr. Elk in 1884. It said that Native people did not automatically become U.S. citizens just because they had been born within the U.S. territorial limits and decided to live separately from their tribes. The court said that Native people were still citizens of their tribal nations by birth, and only Congress could kind of make the determination that U.S. citizenship was extended to Native people, either through a treaty or a special act. And then, of course, if Native people were not citizens, then they couldn't vote, was the Supreme Court's logic, even outside of those particular states' voting requirements. So the Indian Citizenship Act eventually resolved the citizenship part of that question by extending birthright citizenship to Native people. But the questions about voting and voting requirements, as we saw before or after the act, were similar before the act as well.
Thank you, Rose. As we wrap up the Q&A, I want to share some of these kudos that have come in. Thank you to Rachelle and your colleagues at the museum. You've done an exceptional job in preserving the life and work of Zitkala-Sa. Thank you all for excellent presentations. Thank you for sharing this very, very important information for reference and reflection. So I want to give the last question to you, Rachelle. How can we learn more about Zkalasha today? Did she publish her writings? Are there any books about her that you'd recommend?
That's a great question. There are several published books that she does have on record. There's also writings that she has in the Atlanta Monthly and several publications there from the Library of Congress to the various archives, National Archives. Do you have published articles by her? And I'm not sure if you do, but there's a lot of references. One of my colleagues here also has like a real nice book, and even like through the photography that of her silhouettes, there's writings about her, and I anticipate the release of this quarter there's going to be so much more written. And there's also archives that are the BYU collections, and So there's these different sources, and I think the this coin and this recognition is going to produce so much. For example, several months ago, I just put in my podcast, I put in Zitkala-Sa. There's several podcasts that are about her. And yes, there's many writings, but there's also contemporary media. Even PBS has several documentaries and conversations about Zitkala-Sa as well.
That's great. Thank you. Do either of our other presenters have anything to add there?
I would just say I also would like to give kudos to NMAI. All of their resources that are online really made made my job a lot easier, and also to Rose, your expertise and the information that you provided just in the lead up, to the act, made me very certain I should stay away from any specific answers or part of a presentation related to any of the details of citizenship or voting rights. But yeah, just really amazing working with both of these organizations to be able to put this together. It was a real honor for me.
Thank you. Those are all the questions that we have time for today. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to everyone who joined us for this virtual presentation. On behalf of the panel, Arlington National Cemetery, the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, and the National Archives and Records Administration, we appreciate your interest in America's documentary history, and we hope you join us again. Thank you, and this concludes our program.